Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jeffrey Lees. He's Associate Research Scholar in the Behavioral Science for Policy Lab at Princeton University. He received his Ph.D. in Organizational Behavior and Psychology from Harvard University in 2020. He is a behavioral scientist studying the consequences of inaccurate beliefs for organizations, politics, and society, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Dr. Liz, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Likewise, thank you so much for the invitation. I am looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So, let's start with this. What are implicit attitudes exactly?
Great question. There's a lot of debate about what implicit attitudes are. Often that falls along the debate of measurement, but implicit attitudes are the automatic associations we have with targets. Right. Often that definition is automatic and unconscious, although I think there's increasing evidence that people are actually sort of aware of their own implicit attitudes. And but the core of it is this automatic association. The most common one that comes up in popular discourse is with race in the United States, so that people have a less positive. So again, just a general positive versus negative valence. They have a less positive association with African Americans than they do with white Americans, and then that is reflected in the processing speed it takes to automatically categorize, rather not automatically categorize, to sort of categorize in a task, a white face versus a black face, and that relative difference in processing speed being taken as evidence for relative differences in these automatic associations. But you can have implicit attitudes about anything, right? So you can have an automatic association about, a food or a piece of art or a piece of media or a particular person rather than just a group of people, right? So again, implicit attitudes are often studied at the level of stereotypes of groups, but implicit attitudes, just like explicit attitudes, run the full gamut of what your attitude is towards, the level that attitude is towards, right? So we're talking about groups, individuals, categories of things, ideas, or very specific objects, and also the whole gamut of evaluation, right? So it's just there can be positivity or negativity. There can be more concrete attitudes, right? Like something is dangerous or safe, something is healthy or unhealthy. And so implicit attitudes are just the way in which those evaluations are automatic, or the extent to which they're automatic. And so distinguished from explicit attitudes, which is sort of like the much more clear and articulable way that I feel about something. So like I might not like a piece of food, let's say I don't like ketchup. So I have both an explicit attitude, right? I do not like ketchup, and I also have an implicit attitude, which is that if you like take ketchup and like put it in front of me, I'm going to be like, ugh, because I don't like the taste of it. I don't like the smell of it, right? So there's that sort of immediate and automatic negative evaluation of ketchup. That's a toy example, but so yeah, that's how psychologists think of implicit attitudes.
By the way, does the research on implicit attitudes intersect in any way with the research on implicit bias? Because nowadays we hear a lot about that. I mean, what's the relationship there?
Oh, yes. Implicit bias is just a particular context of implicit attitudes.
Okay.
So I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier. Implicit bias, uh, in the broadest sense of the term, is used to describe a context where there's that relative difference in association. So I'll speak operationally. I'll give you a sense of like what you do in the IAT that
Mhm.
leads to the inference that there's a bias for white versus black targets, right? So in the IAT, you're making these quick judgments like on your keyboard, like boom, 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 and you're trying to connect positive words. So like quite literally, like the titular example is good or bad, and then there's a black face or a white face. And so the task is meant to capture how quickly you can make those judgments, right? So if it's like, you know, when you see the word good, and you see a white face, hit the A on your keyboard. When you see the word good and you see a black face, hit L, right? And so the fact that pretty consistently people are quicker to hit A than L, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a the reaction time is much quicker. The inference there is that there's a difference in association. And so when people say implicit bias, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a relative difference in the associative strength of positive or negative attributes towards a target. So again, I'll go back to my toy example. If it's plausible that if you put people in an IAT and rather than giving them a white face and a black face, you gave them ketchup and mustard, that you wouldn't see a mean level difference in people's evaluations of ketchup and mustard. So there wouldn't be a bias in implicit attitudes for these two targets. So implicit bias is just a particular instantiation of implicit attitudes, namely when there is a relative difference, a bias, in the evaluation of one target over another.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, how well can we measure implicit attitudes? Because there are people who criticize this sort of literature a little bit, and they say that, for example, what we measure when we measure implicit bias does not necessarily translate into actual behavior, let's say outside of a laboratory context or something like that. And so they sort of criticize the validity of these measurements. But what do you think about it?
Yeah, so there's definitely an active debate. I don't want to pretend I'm more familiar with this debate than I am. So I'm relatively familiar with some of the debate around the IAT because
Mm-hmm.
I have used IAT data in some of my research, but
Okay.
I'm aware as well that there are other ways of measuring implicit attitudes, and I'm not familiar with them or the debate around them. But
Mm-hmm.
so with the IAT, there's a few questions, and the way I think about it is it's to me as someone as an outsider. When I say an outsider, I mean like someone who wasn't trained to research IAT. Like I didn't do IAT research as part of my dissertation, so I sort of came into the IAT because I found an opportunity to examine implicit attitudes relative to my research interests, which is belief accuracy, the ability to judge what other people think accurately or inaccurately. And so
Mm-hmm.
I found the opportunity to study those in tandem. And so my read of that literature is that it's very much like most debates about measurement in psychology, which is right, there's construct validity, so there's the extent to which the measurement plausibly captures the construct. All
Right.
right, and then there's there's discriminant validity, so the extent to which the construct can be distinguished from other constructs like explicit attitudes. So there's sort of multiple levels. There are the people who are like implicit attitudes aren't even a thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's all just explicit attitudes. And then there are folks who will say, yes, implicit attitudes are a thing, but this is not a great measure because it's noisy and it's noisy at the individual level. Or because it doesn't predict behavior in the way that we might think.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of debate. And so I take the IAT as sort of a noisy measure. I think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that it could be better, or it's in the lower bounds of acceptable range for individual level validity, meaning that like if I take the IAT now and tomorrow, me as an individual, the score will be relatively similar.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I have read is that the IAT is sort of on the lower bounds of that validity, which isn't great, right? We want the more validity in terms of the measure, the more sort of consistency in what it measures is ideal. But I have seen a lot of good evidence showing that it predicts things. So especially when you aggregate it up. So like in my research, I was interested in this phenomena called projection, which in the strictest terms is when my attitudes about something affect my objective judgments about it.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you an example. I'll go back to my silly ketchup example, which, by the way, I sincerely do not like ketchup, so it's salient to me. So if so, in a purely rational sense, my judgment of ketchup should have nothing to do with my estimate of how much you like ketchup. or how
Right.
any random person I meet, both an individual target and in general. But we know that's not the case. We know that people sort of anchor on their own attitudes and project them outwards. They use them in a sense when evaluating others. So what I was interested in is when people are making these sorts of judgments about other people's preferences. So
Right.
if I am judging how likely the population, like what's the population's preference for ketchup over mustard? What's the population's preference for Republicans over Democrats? This study had almost 100 different categories of this, like spanning from music and art, pop culture, politics, things like that, philosophical beliefs. And so people were asked in this study to estimate, right, like what is the population preference here? Ketchup, mustard, Republicans, Democrats. Where does the average person lie on those spectrums, but in these preferences? And so so we know the true value. So in this study, we also measured sort of the true value. So we know what the average person actually likes, and then we can see what the average person thinks other people's like. Usually there's a bias there. Usually there's a level of inaccuracy. And so the question then becomes what predicts those judgments. And what we find is that people both independently project their own implicit and explicit attitudes. So people's own implicit attitudes affect that judgment significantly above their explicit attitudes. So to me, that's evidence, evidence in support of the fact that implicit attitudes are distinct from explicit attitudes, and that they play a visible role in judgment because they predict people's judgment above people's own explicit preferences.
But the social judgment of the preferences of others here, I mean, what does it translate into exactly? Because, for example, if we're talking about a preference between ketchup and mustard or a preference between Democrats or Republicans, I would imagine that, I mean, the way people deal with those two different kinds of preferences would be very different, right? I mean, people wouldn't bother themselves as much with someone not liking ketchup or mustard in comparison to political preferences, for example. Right.
Yes, absolutely. I'm actually pulling up the paper right now because I'm trying to remember these like 100 categories. So yes, in terms of sort of the real world consequences, obviously we care much more about people's evaluations of racial groups, stereotypes and prejudice, or political preferences than we do care about these sort of preferences for non-consequential things. Absolutely. But there's a question scientifically of whether that's different cognitively, right?
Okay.
So there's a couple things here. Is there a meaningful psychological difference between the process that goes on when I judge, does the average American prefer ketchup or mustard, versus does the average American prefer a Democrat or Republican candidate?
Yeah.
So is that a different process, like psychologically different process? I would argue probably not. Where it does differ is in all the things that you're talking about, right? So people put more value on questions of political leaders than they do dietary preferences. People might have more information, right? Like I don't go around, like when I'm on Facebook or on Twitter, I don't see people arguing about ketchup and mustard, but I see people arguing about, being liberal or conservative, or liberal conservative policies or politicians, right? So I encounter more information in the world about Democrats and Republicans than I do mustard or ketchup. So there's a lot of reasons to believe that those judgments might look different. They might be different levels of accuracy because of attributes of the social world. But those attributes of the social world aren't necessarily attributes of cognition, right? It could be, for example, that a process that we call stereotyping is just as it occurs in the same mechanistic fashion for beliefs about ketchup and mustard than it does for beliefs about African Americans versus white Americans. And so if we take that assumption, or rather if we start with that assumption, we say these are basically the same sort of judgment. well, what I would call and what a lot of people call second order beliefs, my beliefs about other people's beliefs about something.
Right.
Um, then we can say, okay, so across these judgments, if we take the assumption, is it useful to take the assumption and look across these judgments and say, do we see a consistent pattern across? And if we do, what does that tell us about the nature of these judgments? In psychology, we often think about this as a matter of generalizability. So, so let me give you another example. So let's say the research on projection is almost entirely, this is not the case. The research on projection is large and vast and varied. But let's say, for example, the research on projection is largely based on people's judgments of like Democrats, Republicans, Black Americans, white Americans, the salient social groups. If that's the case, then we might potentially be biasing that literature because we're not looking at patterns in non-consequential domains, yet domains where the cognitive processes are theoretically the same. And so the reason that in this study I looked at, I think it was 96 different pairs. So like I'm looking at the paper now. So there are some, so I can just give you a taste of what's in here. So preferences for meats over vegetables. So there's a lot of sort of non-consequential things. So preferences for tea versus coffee, Pepsi versus Coke, cats versus dogs, skirts versus pants, like silly things. But there's a lot of consequential things, gay versus straight people, religion versus atheism, African Americans versus European Americans, young people versus old people. And so when we want to think about building these general models of cognition or general models of implicit attitudes, I'm of the opinion that it's important to think about it in a representative fashion. What, right? If I have a strong opinion about ketchup, and that is reflected in my implicit attitudes, from a cognitive point of view, it's as important to study that as it is my opinions about social groups. Because we're here to build a theory about implicit attitudes, not necessarily, or rather, my work is interested in studying broad judgment and use that to inform specific instantiations of judgment, right? So the specific judgment of African Americans versus white Americans. But we need to be confident that the general process happens across domains before we start making specific inferences within a particular domain.
But at this point, do we know enough to answer that question? I mean, if the cognitive basis behind all of these different kinds of social judgments is the same or not?
I think we do. The reason that data set that I'm describing exists is because implicit attitude researchers have been thinking about this broadly. I didn't actually collect that data set. It was actually a public data set that I reanalyzed. So that's sort of where a lot of implicit attitude researchers started. Well, they were interested in implicit bias, but they were also interested in saying, like, where else do we see these patterns? Do we just see this in sort of these strong contexts where people are evaluating sort of highly stereotypic groups, these points of conflicts, racial divides, gender divides, political divides. But do we also see, right, if implicit attitudes is this general phenomena, then we should see it in all domains, and we do. And that's what you can see that in my work and many other people's work, which is just this, which is that you see these patterns in domains where these attitudes are not very consequential, which suggests that the phenomena is a general phenomena, not something specific to these strong contexts of political and ethnic conflict.
By the way, do you also study the accuracy of these judgments? Because, for example, in the literature regarding stereotypes, there's also a big part of it that is dedicated to stereotype accuracy or inaccuracy. So is that something you also study within the domain of implicit attitudes, or in this case, particularly the social judgments that stem from them?
Yes. I'm very interested in that literature. In fact, I would actually describe sort of the outcome variable in this context as stereotype accuracy. stereotype accuracy is one of those really deceptive terms. It gets like when people hear that, some people have a negative knee-jerk reaction to it. So what stereotype accuracy is, the way it's been operationalized in literature, is sort of relative knowledge of group differences. So, for example, if you ask people, which of the following two groups is taller on average, men versus women? Or which of the following two groups has more wealth in the United States, white Americans or African Americans? Right? Those are stereotypic judgments. They are in the most basic sense. They are judgments of a group, stereotypic, and then a relative judgment. So which one is higher or lower on this other trait, right? So wealth, height, et cetera, et cetera. And in general, when you ask people those questions, they tend to get the relative rank order right. And wealth here is a good example of like how, and the following is one of my sort of something that I have been thinking about a lot, which is that judgment accuracy is not one thing. There are a lot of ways in which people make judgments and use judgments to guide behavior. So we know that the following two things are true. There's a fair amount of research on this. That A, if you ask people to rank order the relative wealth levels of different ethnic groups in the United States, so Asian Americans, African Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans, etc., people get that right. Like people know that white Americans have the most money, African Americans have the least money, and then most other ethnic groups are in between in terms of aggregate wealth. So that's stereotype accuracy in a certain sense. But we also know that people get the point estimates wildly wrong still. So despite the fact that people know that African Americans have less wealth than white Americans, they still vastly underestimate that gap, right? So like, again, they know the rank order, but they think it's like this when in fact it's like this. And they think it's been getting better over time, right? So they think it's been sort of closing over time when in fact it's been getting worse over time, right? Like right now, the wealth gap between white and black Americans is larger than it was at the height of Jim Crow 100 years ago in the United States. Most Americans think it's the exact reverse. So here we have this sort of conflicting, it's not a conflicting account of accuracy, but it really matters sort of how you're thinking about accuracy. Are you thinking about accuracy as sort of like a point estimate? Are you thinking about accuracy as the relative sort of like rank order of the categories that you're asking people to judge? How can we integrate those both? And so even just that distinction right there, I find is one that's often lost in these debates about when is a judgment biased, when is a judgment accurate. What you often find is that people are sort of defining them differently in ways that really matter. And so it's sort of a scientific and measurement point. For me, I have to think of it, I think we need a more general model of how people make these judgments because they make both. And critically, when those judgments matter depends on the social context and the ways in which people use that information. I'll give you another. This is the sort of a toy example that I actually use, but I think is really illustrative. Imagine you're in a room and there's 30 people in the room, and it's your task to judge everybody's age accurately and to do it publicly. Now, a couple things are going to happen there. Let's imagine I'm guessing everyone's age, and I get everybody's age exactly 5 years younger than they actually are. So in this context, we see a few things. If we just looked at the mean difference, you would see that on average, I'm getting people 5 years younger. So that would be definitely a significant inaccuracy, significant underestimation of people's ages. And at least in the United States, there's an explanation there, which is social. It is considered rude in the US to overestimate someone's age, like publicly or overtly. And so we have, in this context, a significant bias likely driven by social motives. However, if you think about what I mentioned, 30 judgments, every judgment exactly 5 years under the true value, if you correlated those, it would be a perfect correlation. I would, if my judgments actually looked like that, I would have perfect knowledge of the relative age of other people. Even if I thought that someone was 75, sorry, even if I thought someone who was 75 was 70, I'm still well aware that they're older than someone who is in truth 30, but I think they're 25. And there's sort of a different process, right? So now it's not what social motive leads to a bias, but what is it that leads me in this context to have perfect relative order accuracy. And so there you can come up with an account of like, I can observe, right? There are visible markers of age, and that maybe I can pick them up, right? So now you've asked one person to make a series of judgments, but you can look at them in one way that describes them as biased based on social motives, or another way that describes them as highly accurate based on some other information processing. And that matters because if my goal in the room is to then, let's say then my goal is to interview someone with experience of an event a long time ago, right? If that's my goal, then I'm trying to figure out who the oldest person is. It doesn't matter if they're 75 and I think they're 70. That sort of underestimation is not relevant for that goal. If, however, my job is to determine whether someone is of drinking age, then my point estimate matters, right? The relative judgment doesn't matter at all. That's a behavior that is based on a point estimate. And so already there you can see in which there's multiple ways to think about these judgments, multiple ways to think about the mechanisms that lead people to be accurate or inaccurate, and the ways in which those different judgments relate to different social motives and behaviors. And one thing I think psychologists haven't thought a lot about, because we tend to sort of like study a single judgment in a single context using a single type of measurement, is really coming up with a model for that entire chain. Judgment in social context, multiple mechanisms driving multiple types of accuracy and inaccuracy, and then behavior based on different ways of making those judgments. So that's often how I think about it. And so I see those sorts of patterns in my work on politics. So we see, for example, that partisans have really overly negative and inaccurate beliefs about how out-partisans feel about their own party, right? So if I'm a Democrat, I am likely to vastly overestimate how negatively the average Republican feels about the Democratic Party, and vice versa. So that mean level bias, that negativity bias, we find across party lines. But if you do that, if you ask people multiple judgments about how they think the out party perceives their party, what I call group meta-perceptions, you do find that people have some accuracy in judging the relative judgments. And if you vary the target, so if you say, okay, how do Republicans feel about Democrats, there's not a lot of accuracy. But if you ask, how do Democrats feel about Democrats, people become much more accurate. Or Republicans feel about Republicans. Or Republicans feel about Democrats. So politics is one of those contexts where we see the same pattern too, where you often see mean level biases, these sort of biases towards negativity and competition and hostility. But that doesn't mean partisans don't have meaningful and accurate knowledge of how people in the out party feel about them, about policy, about the world in general. And one of the ways I'm studying this currently is in climate change, right? So if you ask Democrats and Republicans, what do you think members of the other party, what do you think members of the other party's policy preferences are about climate change policies? They pretty consistently underestimate the policy preference, but they get the rank order right. They understand that Republicans are more likely to prefer tax cuts than tax increases, things like that. And so the need for that sort of complexity in understanding the ways in which people make these judgments, these stereotypic judgments, is really a bedrock of my research, and trying to think complexly about them rather than just like, I'm going to measure a single judgment against a single target. I'm going to do a single analysis of that and write a paper around it.
At a certain point there, you mentioned group meta-perception. So do they drive negative out-group attributions, particularly if they are inaccurate?
Uh, my research would say yes. This is some of my favorite research that I've done. It was in my dissertation. And so a group meta perception, as I defined it earlier, but it was in the middle of a longer speech,
Yeah.
is how you think people in other groups perceive your group and your group's behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is distinct from like a stereotype, right? So I might say, like, I think non-white people have stereotypes of white people, but this is more like, how do you think a Republican would react to the Democratic Party engaging in a specific behavior? The thought of this sort of cognitive process came about from thinking about CEOs, right? So if you're a CEO and let's say you're going to engage in a potentially controversial decision, you have to ask yourself, how are stakeholders inside and particularly outside the organization going to react to that decision,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that decision, unless you're like one of a handful of sort of like superstar CEOs, that decision, that how you think other people are going to react has almost nothing to do with you, right? They're not going to be like, oh, CEO Jeff Lees. They're going to be like company X. They're going to be making a judgment of the company, which is a group level judgment. And so in psychology, we use the term metaperception to describe how you think other people perceive you. Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
if I were to ask myself right now, does Ricardo like my shirt? That's a metaperception, right? It's my judgment of how you're perceiving me, and there's a true value. Maybe you hate the shirt, maybe you like the shirt. But group meta perceptions are that at the group level. And so it didn't take me long to say, well, if CEOs are making this sort of judgment, partisans are as well, because they're embedded within a party, which is a group entity that engages in group level coordinated behavior. And so what I find in my research is that those judgments are highly negative relative to the true value. So people vastly overestimate how negatively out-party members will react to in-party behavior in competitive contexts. And to be clear, it's not that they don't react negatively, they do. It's just that people overestimate the negativity. Interestingly, what I find is that when you reframe intergroup conflict to be about intergroup cooperation, that negativity bias goes away. People are pretty accurate at judging how positively the outgroup responds to attempts at cooperation. They just overestimate how negatively the outgroup reacts to competitive behaviors. And so what we find this pretty robustly. We find it in politics. We find it in sort of gender debates. We find it across the world. So we measure this bias in 26 countries across the world, and we observe it in 25. And we find evidence that it is causally linked to actual intergroup hostility. And so that's because what we observe is that when we inform people that they're inaccurate, intergroup hostility goes down. So we take that as causal evidence, right? That if I say I think Republicans will hate Democrats if Democrats do X, Y, Z, and then I present the participant with evidence, actually, we asked Republicans how they felt about this behavior, and in fact, you're overestimating their negativity by a significant amount. And we can actually, we'll show them often very directly, like, you said they were going to be as negative as possible. In fact, they were only moderately negative on this thermometer scale or something like that. What we find is that when people are informed of that, their own negative feelings about the outgroup go down, and critically, they go down much. The effect of that treatment is larger the more someone is inaccurate. Right, so people who get that judgment accurate, that doesn't change their attitude because it's a corrective judgment. It's a corrective intervention. But for people who show like some of the highest level of biases, that intervention is very effective at reducing their own levels of hostility, their own levels of polarization. Mm-hmm. One way I often put this is, perceived polarization causes actual polarization, right? If you think the other side is really hateful, that might lead you to be more hateful. And correcting perceived polarization can reduce actual polarization. So we find that consistently in the U.S. context. We ran that intervention in 10 studies across Europe and in the United States. And in 9 of the 10 studies, 9 of the 10 countries, that intervention was effective at reducing intergroup hostility. And so now we're sort of expanding upon that, trying to determine that's a context of we see this bias and we see what it causes, but we don't know what actually causes the bias itself. And so a lot of my research has shifted there. What leads people to, at baseline, have these overly negative beliefs and inaccurate beliefs about the outgroup? Is sort of a core cognitive bias? That's one explanation. Is it really due to stereotypic thinking? Like it's about sort of like the negativity that comes out of stereotyping? Is it more social? Is it social media or news media that sort of has an incentive to hype up the negativity of intergroup conflict? And so people sort of see that and they anchor on that, those extreme exemplars, rather than having a better sense of what the average person feels. And so that's what I'm investigating now, is the root of this bias.
Is there a relationship between inaccurate meta-perceptions and political violence?
Yes. So there is a great recent paper where they find just that. They basically take everything I just said and transpose it to the context of political violence, and we see exactly that. So when you ask partisans to judge how supportive of political violence is the outgroup, people get that estimate. People vastly overestimate that value, and when you tell them the true value, it actually reduces their own support for political violence. So that's just sort of taking that sort of process of what do I think you think about me and X, correcting it and showing that it actually affects my attitudes in X. That's just moving X to Y. So I was talking about hostility, but if you sort of change the dependent variable to support for political violence, you find the same pattern. There's a really great paper from last year. I wrote a rejoinder to it because it was a very good paper. I can look it up for you. It's in PNAS 2020. But yeah, it's a fabulous paper. And I think one of these examples where, thinking about this process of a partisan, think about a partisan embedded in a group conflict, right? The partisan's not just thinking about individuals, they're also thinking about groups. They're thinking about the group on average. They're thinking about the possibility that that group will engage in collective behaviors that might diminish the power or influence of your own group. And you don't want that to happen in a competitive context. And so then they're making judgments about what that group thinks, what that group might be willing to do, and how that group feels about the in-group, right? And so that can be at broad levels of hostility, that can be about specific policy preferences, it can be about specific behaviors like political violence. And what we're finding again and again and again is if you examine these in competitive contexts, if you examine these specific judgments, they tend to be overly inaccurate and negative, and they are tied to people's own preferences therein. So the political violence one is a particularly interesting one because, of course, we care a lot about political violence. Like it exists in the real world and it is very bad, and so we want to reduce it. And it's encouraging to see that correcting people's beliefs about other people's support for political violence reduces their own support for political violence. So that suggests, again, as I mentioned earlier, that there might be some projection, there's sort of like a reverse projection. There might be a social norm effect, right? So if I think other people, right, in any domain, if you think other people are supportive of something, then you're going to say, okay, this is socially okay, it's socially normative. And so you're going to think it's okay for you to engage in. And then when you tell people, actually, this is not normal, this is not something that most people think is socially acceptable or morally acceptable, then you yourself are likely to update your beliefs and say, okay, this is actually pretty bad.
So I would like to ask you now about moral judgment specifically. So what do we know about how social influence operates on moral cognition?
It's a very broad question, and one I've written about. Sort of like what I was mentioning earlier, there are sort of, when someone's making a moral judgment, there are sort of multiple points in that judgment where social influence can matter, right? So it can matter in my evaluation of the target, right? So I'm making a judgment of some other one's behavior, and some social attribute of that person or the context can affect how I judge them. But there's also sort of the way that the social world affects our judgments before we even levy them against a particular individual, right? So how do moral judgments form? How do people come about the sort of standards that they hold themselves and other people to? And so I think, moral psych is interesting because moral psych is a relatively new subfield of psychology. I would pin it about it really started in the early 2000s, so it's barely 20. I would say it's barely 20 years old. And so there's so many questions that we don't know versus say like research on racial prejudice. Like we've been studying racial prejudice for 100 years for good reason. And so moral psychology, there's still many more open questions. And I don't think we even have a sort of a good model for thinking holistically about the way that the social influences moral judgments. Again, both on the sort of a priori side, the way that the social world influences what we think, what we care about, and then on the discrete side of when we're making this particular judgment, how does the social context affect that judgment? How does the social identity of the person we're judging affect that judgment? I mean, not to say there's not research on this, there's plenty of research on it, but there's no we haven't really reached sort of a unified theory. And I don't have one. If I did, I would have written it up. But really a unified framework for understanding and predicting the way in which the social interacts with moral judgment.
Mm-hmm. So, and I have read in your work specifically about the social moderation of process perspective of moral judgment. So, what is that exactly?
Yes, this is bringing me back because this is the first paper I ever wrote. So the social moderation of process. This is a little in the weeds. So normally the way that psychologists try to establish causality is we have a model of a cognitive process, and then we try to moderate that we try to intervene on that cognitive process. For example, I think inaccurate judgments cause X, and the way that I intervene on that is I correct the inaccurate judgment and show that variance in that correction predicts change in the outcome variable. I can say, aha, I've intervened on the process and I've shown outcome on the variable, right? So that's a sort of a cognitive model. Mm-hmm. So social moderation of process is the argument that, as I was sort of saying before, if we expand the way that we think about the interaction between cognition and social context, we can, if we have a model that incorporates the social context, then we can intervene on the social context in order to inform cognitive theories. The utility of this framework is that it helps us think about contexts where it's hard to intervene on the cognitive process, right? So if my theory is about inaccurate beliefs, it's pretty easy to intervene on inaccurate beliefs. You can just provide someone with evidence that they're wrong. But if your theory is about implicit attitudes, it's pretty hard to intervene on implicit attitudes, right? By their very definition, you can't just tell somebody, hey, you have an implicit bias, so make it go away. The whole point, the whole definition of implicit attitudes is it's not something you have control over. And so it's hard, it's really hard to think about a direct intervention on implicit attitudes. And so what the social moderation of process suggests is that if we build a theory about the ways in which the social world interacts with the cognitive process, then we can test cognitive theories by intervening on the social world, because of course we have much more control over that, right, in a laboratory experiment or in any context. And so that was the point I wrote about this for moral judgment, which is, we have all these sort of very cognitive theories about moral judgment. So for example, one big debate in moral judgment is you're probably familiar with moral foundations theory, mm-hmm. right? So moral foundations theory makes these sort of two claims. It makes the claim that moral judgment as a domain of cognition is unique in the sense that it is distinct from non-moral domains of judgment cognitively. So it is domain specific and it has multiple internal domains, right? So moral foundations theory also argues that there are these unique, inseparable domains of moral cognition: harm, fairness, loyalty, purity, and respect for authority. And fair, it is a sixth one, justice.
Liberty.
Liberty, yes, thank you. Right, so again, there's two arguments there: that morality is a specific domain of cognition that can't be reduced to a broader domain of cognition, and that it has multiple subcomponents. There are other theories in psychology that argue the reverse of both. So dyadic morality theory, which is proposed by Kurt Gray and Chelsea Shine, they say that no, moral judgment is actually not unique to morality. It's a larger process. It's incorporated into a larger set of judgments about harm and causality, and that there is only one domain, which is harm judgment. So this tradition says that like it's all reducible to harm judgments, and all you need to know is the extent to which the judger thinks an action is causing harm, that the actor is acting with intent to harm, and that the receiver of the harm is capable of feeling harm to be able to understand the totality of moral cognition. Right? So those are very different domains. Those are two very different conceptions of moral cognition across multiple dimensions. And so in the paper I talk about like those are really hard to intervene on, right? And both of those have a lot of social components, right? Moral foundations theory talks about, across these domains, right, there's social variance in who supports which. So conservatives are more likely to support all of them sort of equally, where liberals privilege harm and fairness. And then in the harm, on the dyadic morality side, it's all about the judgment of harm caused, intent to cause harm, and the extent to which the target can be harmed, right? It's really difficult to like test mechanisms of these fundamental cognitive processes. It's much easier to change the situation.
Yeah.
And so yeah, part of it is it's twofold. The first is methodological, which is that like if it's really hard to intervene in the cognitive process that you're theorizing about, intervene on a social attribute of the social world that you think is directly tied to that process. But the broader point is the one I started with, which is that to do that, you need a more socially embedded theory of moral cognition in order to make predictions about what attributes of the social world will be directly tied to the cognitive mechanisms that you care about as a psychologist.
So one more question about moral judgment. So what about the perceptions people have of morally questionable actors? So are these meta-perceptions accurate or not?
So yeah, that's a great question. So this is a good segue actually. So it seemed obvious to me, and like I don't think anyone would contend this, that like when someone is deciding whether or not to engage in a behavior that might be considered immoral, that there's some sort of question about there's questions about how moral it is, not only to you but to other people, that a significant part of the decision of whether or not to engage in that behavior is the question of how will other people judge me, right? Will I be socially sanctioned for this behavior or not? That is a meta-perception. That's saying, how will other people judge me for my behavior? And I was kind of surprised to find out there hasn't been a lot of research on this. It really feels like a core part of how we maintain, how people think about their reputation, right, in the broadest sense of the term. And so we just wanted to ask the basic question, do people get that judgment right? And to sort of make a callback to a point I made earlier about measuring accuracy and the ways we measure accuracy, we find two patterns. We find that, yes, in fact, people, if you ask people, here's a constellation of motive judgments, right? Reasons that people might engage in morally ambiguous behavior, right? Positive reasons and negative reasons. If you ask people, how do you think other people will judge a behavior that you've engaged in the past? People get that pretty right. People have a good sense of like the relative motive attributions that will be made of them. However, despite that relative accuracy, at an absolute level, they exhibit a positivity bias. So even though they get the rank order right, they still underestimate how negatively people will judge them on average. And so that's what we find in that study. And I think the richness of that study is due to the methodological complexity of thinking both at the same time about relative judgment and absolute judgment.
So, going back to politics, what is misperceived polarization and how can we understand psychologically where it comes from?
So, misperceived polarization is not unlike what most of what I've been talking about, a misperception about other people, right? So, it's the overestimation of how polarized a particular group is or a particular individual or an aggregate. One of my high horses is that we use the term polarization way too broadly. That I have a paper where I argue that you can find at least 12 meaningfully distinct phenomena that people have called polarization. And so when we say false polarization, that can mean a lot of things, but in general, you see this pattern, which is like this overly negative and inaccurate belief about how angry or hostile or extreme other people are in general. And sort of like I said before, what I'm really interested in now, so that is a pretty well documented phenomena. So the question now is, what causes it? What is the root of that sort of assumed negativity, but also not only just negativity, but extremity, right? So the assumption that the parties are more extreme than they actually are, the assumption of a lack of sort of a lot of shared policy preferences, things like that.
And so, regarding political polarization itself, and this will probably be the last topic of our conversation today. So, do we know of any good strategies to address this issue?
Yes. So, a lot of people, both researchers, but also people in civil society, are concerned about polarization. So, a lot of attempts to reduce polarization are focused on intergroup contact, right? So bringing people together who disagree. And in general, when you do that, it's a positive outcome, right? Obviously, there needs to be mediated a little bit, and ideally in real life, or at least face to face like this, not like in text. But that's a pretty good process for depolarizing. Of course, that's hard and expensive from an intervention point of view, but that's one way. Another way that I think psychological scientists, political scientists are focusing on are elite, what we call elite cues. So trying to get evidence, but also convince politicians that like what they say matters, right? When they get up on the TV and they either model, extremity and polarization or civility and moderation, that really matters, that changes people's behavior. People look to them and model them, and it changes the perception of norms as well. And it changes people's own attitudes. So this is really great research showing that, for example, I'm trying to remember the year, like maybe 2012. So Barack Obama came out in favor of same-sex marriage in the United States and did it publicly. I want to say it was before his election in 2012. Made a video about it. It was very public, headline news. And what you saw is that when he did that, support for same-sex marriage among Democrats shot up, right? So a very clear leader effect where, this is something that had sort of split the Democratic Party. There were, people for same-sex marriage, some people against. But then once the leader said, hey, I've changed my attitude on this, a lot of other people change their attitudes. They follow suit. So we know leader effects matter, and that when leaders model civility at the very least, right? And I think here it's important to distinguish sort of civility from moderation, right? You can have moderate or extreme attitudes that doesn't have to correlate with being hostile or supporting violence or supporting other things we don't like authoritarian policy preferences or anti-democratic attitudes. And so modeling civility, modeling respect for democratic processes and institutions, and modeling sort of a depolarized rhetoric matters a lot. And I think there's a lot more attention now than there used to be to leader effects and trying to convince leaders that they matter. A third domain is what we've been talking about a lot, misperception corrections. We know that a lot of polarization is driven by just objectively wrong perceptions of the outgroup. And you can see this again and again and again, not just at the meta-perceptive level, but, if I just ask you like the percentage of, Republicans who are pro-life, so who are against abortion, or if I ask the average American or the average Democrat, they get that number wildly wrong. They're pretty unaware that there's actually a lot of diversity in Republicans' opinions about abortion. Same with climate change, in fact. So the majority of Republicans actually support most public policy initiatives to reduce climate change. If you ask the Republicans what they think, but Democrats think Republicans are like wholly against it, right? So there's just in basically any domain that matters, you will find pretty systematic misperceptions. And so correcting misperceptions does seem to be an effective way to reduce polarization, at least at the individual level and in the immediate. Like the durability of those effects are often a concern, right? So I can correct your misperception, but that if you go out in the real world and there's something in the real world that reinforces that misperception, you might revert back to the inaccurate belief. And then, of course, last and certainly not least is the question of sort of like social media, news media, right? So, pardon me. The way in which most people engage with these topics is through the media, right? They might know some people, but most debates about abortion don't happen at the kitchen table. They happen on the news media. They happen on television shows. They happen in op-ed columns and on social media. And so the affordances that those platforms offer and the way that they frame things, I think there's a lot of people believe, and there's a lot of research investigating the extent to which that's the case, that the news media and social media exacerbates polarization.
Mm-hmm. Very well. So just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Yes, I have an active scholarly account on Twitter. It's Lees, Lees, and then Plez. So that's supposed to be pronounced please. That's a testament to you can get your PhD and get a D in high school English, because anyone that, if you get like at least a C in high school English, you should probably understand that Lees please probably should have an equal number of vowels. It doesn't. So everyone sees that and they're like Lees ples, and I just like shake my head. But if you are watching this and you're saying I can't get a PhD because I almost failed high school English, that's me. Phonetics aren't my strong suit, but yes. So LEESPLEZ, active. Like I use that for the sharing and dissemination of my scholarly work and other people's work. I also have a website, jeffreymlees.com. So yeah, and I share all the research. So for folks watching, Ricardo has been very kind. All his questions have been about my research. So every question here that we've touched on, I have written about, and you can find public and free available copies of every study that I've done about all the things we've talked about on my website.
Great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of this interview. And Dr. Lees, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I had a blast.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. You will find links to it in the description box of this interview. And also, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters. Per Orga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Castle, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paulo Jorge Arnaud, Luke Kloaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DR PMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zoll, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, and Chris Story. A special thanks to my producers Isa Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Van Egdem, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumple, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrean, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.